Hey guys, Bob from RetroRGB here, and I'm excited to try out Hyperkin's Supa Retron HD. The Hyperkin Supa Retron HD is Hyperkin's first HDMI outputting Super Nintendo clone, and it outputs at 720p. So I want to compare this to the current best solution, a fully modified one-chip Super Nintendo through the open source scan converter, this awesome little retro upscaling box. But since this is the extreme opposite, this really is as good as you could possibly get these days, I also want to try different options. I want to try through an original Super Nintendo on one of these cheap, awful SCART to HDMI boxes. I've done many tests on these things, and they have 5+ frames of lag, and they also process all the video as 480i, not originally 240p. But I also wanted to use an original Super Nintendo with a solution I do like very much, the HD Retrovision component video cables, which add no lag whatsoever, only the inherent lag of your TV. So let's give all these different solutions a try. The only thing I'm not going to do is do different Super Nintendo tests, because there's just so many different motherboard revisions of the 2-chip, and that's a whole other video in itself, 1-chip versus 2-chip. And also, if you're new to my channel and you're not familiar with any of these terms, such as one-chip or OSSC or FrameMeister or lag, definitely check out my other videos, because I think you might actually be interested in the differences between these things and the different uses for them and why some of those things like lag are important. Let's start by doing a quick unboxing and see what they have inside. Well, the unit itself is actually pretty cool. It seems like a pretty decent piece of plastic. Let's see what else we got. 2 controllers. They feel pretty decent. They, just like the other newer Hyperkin controllers, they have the little bumps in the back that kind of fit your hand pretty nicely. And let's see what else they got. HDMI cable and power cable with a USB charger for it. The actual console itself is very similar to the NES version of, that they had just released. You have an NTSC and a PAL switch on the back. You have an HDMI output, and then standard composite video. So, and a 16:9 and 4:3 switch. So hopefully this thing's higher quality, but let's plug it in and see how it looks. As you power on the console, the first thing you actually get is the Hyperkin splash screen, which is a little odd because the game is actually playing underneath it, but that goes away pretty quickly. And one of the things that I noticed is there's actually a bit of motion blur on this. So I guess I'll go back and revisit that later and kind of see what else it has to offer, but overall it's not terrible. The colors are decent. The aspect ratio and size of the playable screen is different, so that's kind of a little bit interesting. But if you zoom in and we look at my typical link test, you'll see that it is significantly blurrier than the one-chip through an OSSC, but it's not too bad. You know, the difference between a 2-chip and a 1-chip is a little bit better. So this is it's more of a step down than going to a 2-chip. But if you look at compared to Hyperkin's NES solution, the Retron 1 HD, I actually think it's better. Partially because of the colors, because the color palette in that original Hyperkin NES, the HDMI NES, is pretty bad. And I think that really translates to an overall poor image. But it's still, I think, the Super Nintendo version of this that I'm testing today isn't as bad, and it's certainly passable. And also, one of the things that I've seen a lot of people talk about was, well, is it just a cheap composite video upscaler going to HDMI? And as you could see, no, most definitely not. Here's the comparison between an actual just cheap composite video to HDMI converter versus the Supa HD versus the one-chip, and you could very clearly see that at the very least the Supa HD is doing better than composite video upscaling. Next, I want to demonstrate the HD Retrovision cables. but how your TV processes the 240p component video signal would really determine how good this solution is. So unfortunately, it's going to be different results for everybody, but I thought a good test would be to take just a generic Samsung 1080p flat screen and take video of that versus the Hyperkin solution, just to see how your average consumer might view both of these. Because I've seen cases where certain TVs do amazing 240p upscaling and others don't do it so well at all. So I felt this was a good way to demonstrate a real-world scenario of these cables. Now I want to show that generic SCART to HDMI converter, set to 720p of course to make sure that it's an even comparison. And a lot of people end up with these converters because they think that you could just buy any console and then buy an RGB cable, which is the highest quality output, put it through one of these, and you'll have an excellent signal. But the truth is there's just no way that's possible, both because the lag that this introduces and the way it processes the 240p progressive signal as interlaced. And already you could kind of see that both the Hyperkin solution and this one are very similar, so I'll be interested to see further on when we test a bit more. Also, it does seem to support FX games, which is pretty nice. Star Fox seemed to work without any issues whatsoever, which is a good sign because compatibility is important. Regardless of price, you want your console to be able to play everything that you have. And speaking of compatibility, this is actually compatible with the SD to SNES. I assume it would be compatible with the Super EverDrive as well. I just don't have one of those to test. But at the very least, this one is compatible with the ROM cart that I used, and in my opinion, the best Super Nintendo ROM cart. So not only does it work with that, it does also work with the MSU audio games, which is pretty awesome. And speaking of audio, here's an audio test comparing both Mario and Zelda to the Supa HD, so you can get an idea of how accurate the audio reproduction actually is. Before we get into lag testing or anything else, I just want to go back and revisit that blur that I saw before. It seemed to only happen while things were in motion, so let's just kind of take a look and see on my flat screen TV if we could pick it up and figure out where it's coming from. So now I want to dig into that blurriness I saw before. You can see here in the SD to SNES menu, every time I go up and down an option, you could kind of see how it feels like it bounces almost, and then it gets a little bit blurry and then gets sharp again. So let's see it with the scroll test, and you could absolutely see it demonstrated right now. Look at every time the palm trees are moving, it gets blurry, and then as soon as it stops, it gets sharp again. I wanted to try this both on a different TV and via the composite video output. So let me just switch over to AV here. And you could definitely see the picture quality go down. But as soon as everything starts scrolling again, it still happens, which means the problem is inherent to the clone chipset itself and not the upscaler. So it's not something they could fix just by putting in a different upscaling chip. And also, while it's hard to see in this video, both through HDMI and composite, I could actually see the stereotypical white line issue, which is just a vertical line that goes down about slightly off-centered through the middle of the screen, and it was definitely easier to see with composite video, but if you kind of stare at the center of the screen while it's scrolling, you could certainly see it. Now here's the same test with the HD RetroVision cables. There's definitely no blurriness in the menus. So now when we go down to the scroll test, No, I mean, there's really no blur effect like that. So I know that this TV, while it's not a great TV, definitely processes 240p correctly. So let's go back and check that generic scaler and see what happens with it. So here's that generic scaler again, once again set to 720p just like before. And as you go through, you could actually see the menus jumping just the way they did on the Hyperkin solution. So when we go to the scroll test, it's the same thing. Every time there's movement, everything blurs. And I know for a fact that this device incorrectly processes 240p progressive as 480i interlaced. So that means that Hyperkin solution processes the signal as 480i even when it's still in its raw form before it's even converted to composite video or HDMI. That's kind of crazy. That means there's really nothing they could do to improve the signal on this at all. Okay, now for some lag testing. So here we have composite video output going into the PVM, and then we have the 720p HDMI output going into a zero lag HDMI to component converter. I've actually tested this before when I was doing lag testing on different upscalers and flat screens, and then into a D-series BVM that could handle up to 1080i. So let's go over to the lag test. And now I'll do a slow motion capture so we could actually see what the differences are. So as we watch it in slow motion, you can see that the lag is really bouncing between 2.5 and 3.5 frames of lag. That's one of the things too that kind of annoys me, because it's human nature. If for whatever reason it was very consistently 1.2 frames of lag, then we humans could usually just train our fingers and hand-eye coordination around it. It's the variable lag that drives me crazy, because no matter how hard you practice, it's going to be different every time. But if you check out the still shots, yeah, there is definitely a range, and I would say it averages 3 frames of lag. In comparison, the FrameMeister is about 1.5 to 2 frames, and the OSSC is 0. Well, let's pull this thing apart and see what's inside. So it's just got these tabs on the bottom, which I think you just pop right off. Okay, here you go. Alright, bottom comes straight off, exposing these boards. Let's just pull these apart. Okay, here's the main cartridge. Bunch of different ICs on it. I'll get still pictures of this so you can zoom in and see what's really on here. Here's the output board on the bottom. And here's just the power and reset board. So overall, it seems very well built. I like the design, I like the eject lever, and I certainly like the plastic cases that Hyperkin's been using recently. They're pretty good quality. But let me get some still shots of all these so we could zoom in and see which chips are really on here. Here's a close-up of the board that they used to do all of the actual processing, and while this is obviously just speculation, it looks like every generic SNES clone that I've seen before. I believe Yobo makes a bunch like this. I don't have one of the original Hyperkin SNES clones, but I'd be willing to bet it was extremely similar on the inside. And then if you go over to the AV board, you could actually see where I think the RGB lines go into just a generic upscaler that goes from apparently 480i to 720p, and then of course out to HDMI. So overall, not a really complicated thing, and also it doesn't seem to be very new. These just kind of seem to be the basic technology they've been using, and then just with an HDMI chip built into it. But once again, this is only speculation because I obviously don't have any of their design docs or anything. So as you can see from everything that we went over, the correct answer to what I recommend 100% depends on your situation. I don't like any of the solutions that process 240p as 480i because you get that very weird blur that I demonstrated. And of course, the Supa Retron HD isn't the most accurate for sound, but overall it has less lag than this scaler. So if you don't already own a Super Nintendo, maybe this is a pretty decent box for you, because you do have an NTSC and PAL switch if you want to play original cartridges. You don't have to worry about doing any of the Super CIC mods or anything kind of crazy. And the bottom line is, it just kind of works. I mean, you plug in your game and that's it. The only downside is $70 seems like a bit much for something like this, especially when Hyperkin's recent product, the NES version of the HDMI upscaler, only cost $40. So $70 is a lot of money for something that has 3-ish frames of lag and doesn't process its video correctly. But you know what? It still isn't the worst solution. I still think 5+ frames of lag is worse. And if you're playing on a flat screen TV. That being said, if you already own a Super Nintendo, I really love the HD RetroVision cables, or if you have a really good SCART to component video converter, or if you just have a TV in Europe that actually supports SCART input, just using an original console is great. You do get a much softer picture when you go 240p directly into most flat screen TVs, but you have zero added lag and just all the original accuracy of an actual Super Nintendo. And the only time I would really recommend these, if you have an original SNES and you know you're eventually going to be upgrading to an OSSC, you just don't have the cash right now and you want to pick one of these up, totally fine. Video streamers, Twitch streamers use these all the time as well, where they have one display as a tube TV with zero lag, and then they use these to stream out to Twitch, which is a pretty decent use, to be honest with you. But overall, I just think, especially because my channel is really focused on getting the best quality out of your consoles, at the moment, you still just can't beat an original Super Nintendo through one of the better solutions, either the OSSC, the HD RetroVision cables, or some of the others like the FrameMeister or some of the other RGB to component converters. So the only difference is if you don't already own a Super Nintendo, a higher quality one or a mini with all the mods is going to run you at least 100, but more like 150. And then the open source scan converter is over $200 in itself. And the HD RetroVision cables are, I believe, 50 or 60. So you are talking a pretty huge price difference from just a $70 box. So I guess in the end of the day, it's really up to you. If you don't have a great flat screen, you might not actually notice the incorrect video processing as much as if you have a really nice flat screen. And if maybe you're not even sure if you want to get back into playing your original Super Nintendo cartridges, and you just want to give this a try and see what you think. But overall, I don't hate it. The processing of 240p as 480i does drive me crazy though, because my eyes can't unsee that once I've seen it. But overall, I didn't hate the audio output. It wasn't as bad as a lot of other clones that I've used. And 3 frames of lag isn't good, but at the end of the day, it's certainly not even close to as bad as some of the worst situations out there. Just remember to put your TV in game mode. So I guess enthusiasts are not going to use this as their main console, maybe as a spare, or if for whatever reason you needed dual HDMI and composite video output at the same time. But anybody else, especially people just getting back into classic gaming, might actually want it. I just think $70 for something that doesn't really work that great with video is a bit much. I don't know how they could have cut costs or if they could have just used a different video processing chip. But either way, it's certainly not the worst thing I've ever seen, and it's certainly a ton better than that composite to HDMI converter I saw, because those are absolutely awful, and I think those even have more lag than these do. So at the very least, it's certainly not the worst, and it's not the most expensive. If you like this video, please subscribe and share with your friends. Also, maybe consider donating to my Patreon, because my amazing Patreon subscribers are the only reason that I still am able to do all this stuff. So thank you guys so much. And as always, any comments or criticism, please leave down below. I love to hear from you guys, and I'll see you next time.